Hello and welcome to today's webinar on increasing engagement and customer insight with mobile location tracking. I'm Megan Winnery, Senior Demand Gen Manager at Telium, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar will last approximately 30 minutes and will be recorded, and the slides and the recording of the presentation will be made available at the end. We also have some related resources in the attachments and links section that you can view during or after the webinar. And lastly, we want to hear your questions, so please use the Q&A feature to submit them. And for any questions that we aren't able to answer live, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the presentation is over. All right, on to today's presenter. We're fortunate to have David Morris with us today. David is the Director of Solutions Consulting at Telium in EMEA and an expert in building data solutions. With over 10 years experience in big data management, David has helped develop best practices surrounding data collection, management, actioning, and governance. Working with household names on a daily basis, David has supported them in interpreting data to improve business intelligence, digital marketing, and conversion optimization. David's experience of cross-device customer engagement has enabled him to help businesses develop solutions that drive revenue growth through omni-channel marketing. All right, now for today's presentation, David, take it away.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you as well for joining our webinar. Just want to, start off with just let you know the high-level topics that we're going to talk about today. We're going to have a look and, in some sense, remind ourselves of today's mobile landscape, what it is that people are using, the trends that we're seeing, the trends as businesses we need to recognize are happening as we strategize ahead. Look at the ways in which mobile and the location of mobile, the personal touch of mobile, affects those strategies and remaining competitive. And then lastly, but not least, have a look at some tips, some ideas around how we can make sure that the mobile channel is both optimized and part of a wider strategy as a business. Again, looking at the way that location in particular helps businesses and supports them in that as well. So what are we looking at today? What is our world, as it were, with kind of mobile usage? Well, if you look at some of the kind of key stats that have come out over the last year or so, it's quite clear that we're not only using our mobile more. I personally know that anyway. I use my mobile all the time. It's a big enough device that I can nearly do all my work on it. I can do all my personal stuff on it as well. And we can see also that over the coming years, or the previous years, the increase over the global population of using mobile devices has just kept on growing. We don't expect that to change. In addition to that, and probably slightly, I suppose we know it deep down in our hearts, our personal devices know a lot about us, for the broadest sense of know, and they know everything we're up to. We use it for organizing what we're going to do. We treat it very much like we did a diary when we were like little kids hiding a little diary under our pillow. We put all of our personal information into that, and now that's what we do with our phones. It knows sometimes more than maybe things that we're willing to share with other people, and so it's a very personal device. So as marketeers, as business strategists, we look at that now and we should recognize that personal devices have an opportunity and a window for a better relationship between brands and consumers. So that competitive landscape is changing, and we see that in a number of ways. One of the ways that we see that is the amount of information that people recognize that they need to collect and understand about their consumers, and the fact that now that is going to continue to grow. The second part of that competitive landscape is recognizing that the competitive edge actually comes from the information shared directly between a consumer and a brand. And actually that first-party data becomes the competitive edge that a brand has, and they should use wisely and make sure they don't squander it. So when we think about that competitive edge, we need to recognize that it isn't just a mobile, but mobile is a key component. And so when we think about the data we need to be able to understand people's interests and recognize what they are looking for from a brand, we also have to recognize that the whole journey so the whole interaction experience that people have with us, does actually represent a lot of different interactions, a lot of different data that is flowing around. And very often we assume, or as businesses, we want people to be in some kind of engagement funnel that follows a process that we've defined. And for example, we think people should start from the top and work their way to the bottom, and they'll stay there, and that's what we hope for as a business. And whilst that at a high level is where we want to get to, the reality is, and we know this as consumers ourselves, we don't follow this kind of linear path. In fact, we follow much more of a path that, if we're a little bit more honest about it, it looks a bit like that. And this path here is something which is much more in the way that customers and consumers engage and have interactions with brands, where they have kind of clusters of interactions with each channel. So channels here, I guess, are represented in different colors, all different interactions are little circles. And you can see from this that what we really see when it comes to customer interactions is a scattering of behavior in one channel than the next. And what that causes is the understanding of me to be represented in lots of different ways, partially, across all of those channel touch points. And so this customer journey isn't linear, it's spreading out all over our channels, and different bits are interacting in different ways. And as a business, we need to get our arms around this so that we can get those different touch points, those interactions gathered together, and that's what businesses are always seeking to do. And we have historically called it the single customer view, or the single source of truth. And what tends to happen in various projects that people want to do is they want to get all this data together and get all the data together, and that makes sense. But then what they tend to happen is they then get stuck at the point where they're trying to work out which IDs to use to recognize that person across those different channels, and how to bring that together in one place. And sometimes you end up with this kind of Frankenstein on the graphic here. And that often happens when brands look to try and use IDs or information to guess who that person is rather than know absolutely. So be probabilistic rather than deterministic in the way they recognize people. And that can bring about a level of uncertainty as to whether you are talking to exactly that person every time, which makes it hard then to have that one-to-one personalization. And that one-to-one personalization is what our consumers are looking for, particularly when they engage with us using a personal device like a mobile phone. So as we consider that, we should remind ourselves that companies are keen and in fact put a huge priority on achieving exactly that, and yet they would quite happily admit that maybe only 25% of them in reality have got to a point where they feel they have got there. And if we look at the way that we do these kind of single customer views, they are very often in data sets that allow us to analyze that customer, but not necessarily act on that customer. And so that, again, we end up with a silo that we have to try and deal with that activation piece after the fact. So because mobile is a very personal device, and because we have an opportunity as marketeers or as brands to be able to communicate to people, we need to make sure that we don't isolate mobile as a separate thing, but rather see it as part of the whole. And that's one of the important things to bring out of today's webinar, really. So we need to also do that in light of a number of key things, and one of those being privacy. And we will all be aware to some level about GDPR or e-privacy or various other mechanisms that people are using to try and enhance and control the privacy they have, depending on the level of trust they have with people that they share their data. And one of those things is this kind of precursor to change that we see, and we have seen over across the industry, both as consumers, but also the way that brands are forced to interact as well now. And there's research in various places, like Data IQ did a GDPR impact research recently on mobile and digital, where people over the last couple of years have almost doubled their kind of trust, as it were, in who they share their data with. However, they still are seeing a kind of slow to respond by brands the ability to be able to personalize in the mobile device in the same way that they get personalization in other channels. So at the moment, consumers, according to the research, see mobile as quite isolated still, but they're looking for it to be more integrated. And so this change of wanting more trust between consumers and brands requires that to be there up front so that brands can use this data across different devices. And so whilst consumers are looking for more brand trust, at the same time technology is also providing solutions to consumers should they want to reduce what they share and provide extra protection in that way. And you can see that in the rise of ad blockers, where people are either doing it because the adverts aren't relevant, or they're doing it because they want to prevent the cookies behind them from being gathered, to technology powerhouses actually putting technology or features inside their own product where people are already using that product and are now taking advantage or simply having that feature enabled around intelligence tracking. These two things really look at the way that cookies are operating against people and giving them the options to make decisions of whether they really want that or not. So we recognize that people are looking in the industry either for solutions to help them or for law to help them with that way of working. So that, along with, say, for example, your ability to pick up very granular data around mobile, not treat it as a separate channel, but realize that you have to have the idea of who that person is as well as their trust levels and adhere to that, brings us to the next point. What do we do now? How can we use this information? What information is available to us? How can that impact our strategy? Well, one of the ways is to recognize the kind of levels of data actually available. And first of all, mobile has a huge amount of data available to it, and some of which is completely unique to mobile as well. So we're not talking about my service plan. We're talking about things like the ID that represents me for that device, so the IDFA if I'm using an iPhone, for example. Or it will be all the behavior I do inside the native app, or the website app, or the web app, or the website itself if I'm outside of my mobile. All the device information about the device itself as well. This is a huge plethora of data. Crash data for developers to help understand how their app is actually performing on people's devices. And this is now accessible to marketeers as well, to help understand people's experience with their brand on their personal device and start leveraging that. And that huge amount of consumption does then give a rise to technologies that want to be able to help businesses with that collection of data. And so one of the key things that brands need to really think about is, when I start collecting data from mobile, am I going to create another data silo in the way I do it, or am I going to do it as part of my wider data supply chain or data strategy as a business? So as we think about the amount of mobile data we have, that forms part of one of the sources of information about our consumers. And it gives rise to the need to be able to say to ourselves, we must have a view on alternative data points that we can use to recognize people. And when it comes to mobile, particularly apps, cookies just aren't always in the frame. They aren't a way that we can recognize a person coming back through some kind of anonymous ID in the same way we could do on a website. As mobile continues to be widely proliferated around what we do, like we saw in the first couple of slides, we need to think about this as not just another device to track. And when we start thinking about location data, we will a little bit more in a minute, people like Carto, who are a data location company, they did some joint research with Hanover back earlier this year. It was called the State of Location Intelligence. And when they surveyed over 200 C-level execs on how they use location data, top 3 use cases came out. Identify new consumer markets, so understand where a lot of people live and how they use their mobile phones there. Improve marketing strategies, so understanding that the mobile behavior is, if not more important than other behavior on the digital realm. And also, a big thing really came out of it was consumer experience. So this is a much more of an altruistic view of a brand, to be thinking about, how do I use this understanding of who they are, where they are, to better serve them as a customer, as opposed to just trying to upsell to them. So as we consider these kind of data points that we have, and we think about those other things as well, let's also have a look at the way that we engage with our brands in a non-mobile and a mobile venue as well. So, for example, we expect our mobile commerce, so the actual traffic that comes through when it comes to generating revenue, to reach almost 45% of all the total e-commerce by 2020. So nearly half of all of the mobile commerce environment or e-commerce environment will come from mobile in just a couple of years' time. That means that businesses need a shift. And so when we have historically looked at cookies as a way for recognizing people as they come back, we now need to find another way of doing that. And that's what the technology industry provided. So to fill the gap where apps don't have cookies, we get IDFAs for Apple, we get AAID, so the Android Advertising Identifier in Android devices, and we use those to be able to reliably identify those devices when they come back. Now, to do that is great. Okay, at device level, I see you coming back. And as we'll see in a minute, using location data helps us to really understand how we can leverage that even further. But one of the key questions that's going to come off the back of this is always going to be, if I've got a cookie on a website and I've got a mobile ID on a mobile device, how do I tie that person together? And we're going to definitely cover that as well today in the webinar. So, what is it about location and mobile that makes it particularly special? Well, one of those things, and one of the key things when you think about cookies, is that third-party cookies in particular have been used historically to provide context to that person in some way. So it kind of travels and follows you around the web. You get some high-level understanding of my interests because I've been to a telecoms website, I've been to a car website, I've been to a retail website of this particular type. And then when I land on a travel site, that third-party cookie holds enough information for me at a high level to understand my overall other interests. We've already seen how both the privacy environment and technology itself is reducing the ability to use those cookies. And at the same time, we're seeing a rise in mobile, where we're seeing location being something that is accessible to mobile apps. That location now gives that context in the same way that third-party cookie did. It does, sorry. And so that allows you now to say, okay, based on where they are right now, what is the environmental context for them? So, and we'll get onto examples later, but the idea being that within half a click for me, there is a car showroom, for example, or I am in this particular location for a period of time, and so if I'm in a grocery store, maybe there's some context around that I should be focusing on when I want to interact with this person. So location and in the moment becomes available and possible for marketeers and strategies around data because of the way that mobile is now relating. We don't have to wait for them to come to our own site, just like third-party cookies, because their phone is in their pocket. We are now moving from pixels, as it were, to people themselves. So we can now have a view of a person because we're bringing not just data from mobile from other channels into one place as we try and build that single source of truth. And we are also doing that by recognizing that people's mobile location gives us a key recognition of who they are and what they are interested in as well. So how do we use this information to try and optimize in some way the way that we use mobile in our strategy, whether it be through simple use cases of that or from a wider perspective, recognizing it is its own data source? So let's have a little think about that. One of the things that we can do is make sure that the cookie's role in what our data strategy isn't what we rely on, but rather we recognize that that cookie has a part to play, and it's not going away, but it is now no longer the only thing that we should be using to recognize people at an anonymous level and even getting some kind of interest-based information from them. With GDPR coming out, in particular, or the enforcement of it very soon, along with e-privacy, the focus on cookies and what they can do, what people are allowing them to do and where they're allowed them to be, is going to be all the more heightened. And so other forms of ways of understanding that interest needs to come. And so your strategy should now be thinking about the different types of location data that you can attach to people. So whether it be the region and therefore the language, or whether it be the type of services that are surrounding them, or simply just be the country they're in or the location they're normally in to suggest a kind of interest in behavior. So cookies play a role, but now as we move around a lot more, location provides that. Another part of our strategy is to look at the way we actually consider the fact that people are always on. So it's not just where they are at the time, but the fact that we know that that phone is always on. So they are, I don't know about you, but I look at my phone a lot more than 2 hours a day. I look at it probably last thing at night when I first wake up in the morning. It's always available to me. And interacting with me at that level is something I'm prepared and accepting of because it's always in my hand. And so because it's that always on piece, we should consider in our strategy how we leverage that. And one of the ways we can leverage that is start thinking about, okay, if I am a grocer and I know they're in one of my stores because of the location on from the mobile phone, and I've been there for more like 20 minutes, then maybe I could ping them in with a push notification to say, do you need help finding something? You can go to the customer service desk, or please make sure you approach one of our friendly staff. So I know you're in my store, you've been there for maybe longer than you normally are, I want to kind of reach out to you and kind of get a customer service. Maybe if I return to the same location a number of times, that suggests that I have a continued interest in that. So, or if I am going to a various type of store, it shows a certain kind of interest in, say, I'm currently looking at cars at the moment because I keep going back to a showroom. Maybe, on the other hand, and this is common to the way that media publisher companies and also kind of like publishers have worked, is understanding people to be in niche markets because they are more valuable in the marketing realm. And if you go to locations which are far more niche and therefore recognize a particular niche interest, then again, people can start using location in those same broader categories they had before, but just a different data source to identify that. Another one might be my in-store experience. Because it's an always-on device, and because I'm in-store, I can actually say, okay, that person's in our store right now. I want to do something about that and interact with them, rather than waiting for the batch data that comes out of my store environment to get added into my online data and then be working after the fact on the fact they're in our store. So that's very important. I've got like one example of that in South America where a shoe company decided that what they were going to do is whenever they recognized that one of their customers was in a competitor's store, they would send them a notification and say, congratulations, we're giving you 100% off your next pair of shoes with us. You will lose 1% of that for each minute it takes you to get to one of our stores. And so quite innovative, use location, use mobile, interact with people at a personal level, and encouraging sales in the moment to get that done. So optimizing your strategy because to recognize that people are looking at their phones all the time, prepared to engage with them, and be there where they are. So what are some key points to remember when we look at our kind of a mobile first strategy? So first thing, let's just make sure we actually collect all this data accurately. And that's no easy task. Let's do it in a way as well that is governed in a central way and not just a kind of point-to-point connection of data from one place to the other. So if you have a way in which you're collecting your web data right now, then make sure that's the same way you use for your mobile. Don't have a separate strategy for it because you're going to end up with separate silos all over again. So make sure your data collection strategy is unified. That's one core thing to do. Make sure when you're doing that, you're doing it in an agnostic way so that no one vendor that wants to make use of the data for you is the one who holds all of your data unless they are an agnostic product, unless they are willing to share it however you see fit across any of your marketing or internal systems. Recognize that mobile gives you a device ID very quickly. So that kind of sounds like you can therefore get an ID a lot quicker to recognize that device, which is true. People delete cookies, they don't delete an IDFA number. So having a mobile first strategy allows you to be able to recognize that user a lot quicker and in a more resilient way. So when you capture the consent for that, just be mindful. In my mobile app, when I'm using it, I get told, this app wants to use your location, do you allow it? And that's my phone asking me that. But it often asks me the moment I open that app for the first time. And if I have no trust, so going back to the regulations and the trust aspects, if I have no trust with that mobile app provider yet, I've just downloaded it, maybe that is not the right time to be asking for location. Maybe instead of asking it because the device or the app wants to use it, we should consider asking it when we feel like there's a relationship that has grown between the user of the app and the company themselves. So Now, just like with our website, when we put up our privacy notice and say, please consent, we now need to consider saying all the services that we offer as to why we're asking for it at all, rather than just simply saying, please give us your location. It is a key component now to our strategy. Let's focus on our services around it at the same time as requesting it. When we bring location data against the customer, we need to also consider not just the trust that we've empowered them to be able to do that, but also the ways in which we connect the online world between mobile and web. And that's where you need to make sure you have both a technology and a business strategy for deciding when you recognize people across those devices in a similar way. And part of that is ID management, and part of that is deciding whether you are happy to guess, so probabilistic, or know for sure, deterministic. And the more people want to be talked to one-to-one, and the more we need to be able to show that we can be audited to show that we know where we got our consent from, the more brands now need to focus on deterministic rather than probabilistic to do that. We should also be considering how we educate, like it says on the slide, our peers themselves, so help them understand that the wider opportunities with mobile and location, as opposed to simply keeping from a desktop world. And then as well, as we kind of transition our marketing strategies, particularly if we go to a mobile-first realm, which more and more businesses are starting to do now, we need to consider how mobile really works. How can we actually leverage this information rather than simply saying that is just more data in the big data world that will just take time for someone with an egghead to work out for us. As a business, we can work these kind of strategies out for ourselves. Okay, so if we just wrap up with the next slide, think about some key takeaways. So when we look at, for example, we look at making sure that we maintain our competitive edge. Make sure it's the data that we are interacting with our own consumers that we collect accurately in a robust way and apply against what we feel is a reasonable user profile or central user data set so that we can talk to somebody in a one-to-one manner. Make sure that mobile isn't isolated away in a separate mobile team or a separate strategy, but part of a wider whole. Just in the same way that we used to see that email was separate to all the other marketing channels, but now we see that they should all work cohesively together against one user or one profile about somebody. In the same way, we should make sure that our data sources, like mobile, should be seen as part of the whole when it comes to understanding interactions with our brand. Let's consider now that location is going to become, if it not already is, the new third-party cookie to understanding context around people's interests before they come to your own properties. And let's not forget, and it's last but not least, that when we understand more about people's location, it always comes down to having had consent for that, and that consent should be gathered with a relationship in mind and not just a functional requirement for it. So that's kind of like a wrap-up on takeaway slides. I hope you found some of those slides useful. And of course, we'd love to open up to any questions that are available as well.
All right, thank you. If you have questions, please make sure to answer them in the questions section and we'll get to them. All right, so first question we have is, with respect to your shoe store example, most consumers disable location for mobile apps when the app is in the background or not running. How do you counter that?
Yes, I think it's a very it's a valid point, and that's part of the trust aspect. You could take that question and you could equally relate it to how do I guarantee that, or how do I improve the chances of somebody who is going to give consent on my website as well. And really, that is, at that point, it's actually us as brands marketing to consumers to explain to them the reasons why we're asking and the benefits it gives them. And I think we're pretty familiar with that on a website perspective, but we don't yet kind of translate that viewpoint or the way in which we engage with people through mobile apps to portray that kind of level of trust as well through services or advantages to them. You know, Waitrose are a good example of this, I have to say. I'm going to call them out because they openly say to me, if you tell us what your interests are, we will give you better promotions for the things that you like. So of course I'm going to tell them what my interests are because I want to get money off on the things that I like. And the same goes for this kind of thing as well.
All right. Well, thank you, David. We're out of time, so if you ask a question and we weren't able to get to it, we'll make sure to follow up with you afterwards. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And David, thank you for a great presentation. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.